Welcome to The Reality Taboo, where no topic is off limits. It's August 14th, 2026. I'm Jeff. Joining me is my co-host Ness. First topic is the pitfalls or limitations of independent media. I want to start with a recent interview that Tucker Carlson did with Hunter Biden. In the promotional material for that episode, the Tucker Carlson network posted a promotional teaser. Quote, "What is the truth behind the Hunter Biden laptop story?" it asked. The official narrative is that the computer mysteriously showed up at a Delaware tech repair shop, but that is not true. The reality is that there never was a physical Hunter Biden laptop. And according to the post, an unknown party had hacked Hunter Biden's iCloud account, downloaded its contents, and placed them on a laptop that was never his. Tucker's promotional material there actually overstates my understanding of what Hunter actually said in the interview, and Ness can chime in shortly because he actually listened to the full interview. I have not, but my understanding is during the actual interview, Hunter Biden told Carlson he has, quote, zero recollection of dropping off a laptop, and argued that the material which became public came from, quote, multiple sources, including cloud data, end quote, rather than from one physical device he abandoned. And Hunter did not on the record claim his iCloud was hacked. And a few years ago, the owner of the Delaware computer repair shop, John Paul Mac Isaac, sued Hunter Biden, and then Hunter Biden's attorneys filed a counterclaim, and that counterclaim did not dispute that Hunter dropped the laptop off. It conceded the physical transfer and argued instead about narrower questions of whether the device counted as legally abandoned and whether Mac Isaac violated Hunter Biden's privacy by copying and distributing the data rather than simply deleting it. So if it were clear, indisputably, as Tucker Carlson states, that it wasn't Hunter Biden's laptop, presumably that would have been asserted in a lawsuit against Hunter Biden. And there supposedly is paperwork that Fox News obtained years ago from the Mac shop showing a signed intake form for the 3 MacBook Pro laptops billed to Biden, but apparently that documentation did not, or it was not able to, the signature was not able to be independently verified. And then also Mac Isaac was subpoenaed to testify in federal court in Delaware in December 2019. And that was before the Hunter Biden laptop story broke. And just a brief refresher on the context of the Hunter Biden laptop story. It broke back in October 2020, just a few weeks before the 2020 presidential election between Biden and Trump. And as you recall, on October 19, 2020, there was the infamous 51 intelligence officials letter that essentially a bunch of spooks from the intelligence agencies like Michael Morrell, James Clapper, Leon Panetta, they all signed a public letter stating that the laptop material had, quote, all the classic earmarks of a Russian information operation. And that was when the Russiagate hoax still had a bit of juice in it, and that could still attract some attention. If the Donald Trump as a Russian agent still had a little bit of power back then. I think that's pretty much dissipated by now. And Tucker Carlson and Fox News in general and the right-wing media just trashed this letter and talked about how absurd it was. And then Tucker Carlson at that time was still at Fox News. And on October 19, 2020, his opening commentary on his nightly show, Tucker Carlson Tonight, argued that Joe Biden had shaped American foreign policy to benefit his son's business interests and framed the platform and media suppression of the story as a big threat.
This was prior to the Ukrainian war that was maintained, supported by the United States for years in Biden's subsequent presidential term. So I think we are at a little bit of risk if we minimize the strength, the compulsion that the idea that Trump was in bed with Russia and that more broadly that Russia was an intractable enemy of the Western world, of the United States, and was interfering in everything in America. I don't think we should minimize that. That was very much still in play at the time and would remain in play for several years afterwards. This happened a couple of years before the sustained proxy war that the United States waged against Russia on behalf of Ukraine, that I don't think conceivably could have happened absent the cultivated anti-Russian hysteria that had been building for almost a decade by the time the Ukrainian war started. And this was 2 years prior to that. And the reason I'm seeding that there is because I'm going to push back a little bit at some of the criticisms that Jeff will have for Tucker Carlson for playing fast and loose with the truth, because, of course, the corporate media ran with these, what looks like in retrospect, and even at the time seemed like obvious tripe, that these intelligence officials were putting in this letter that this was somehow Russian disinformation, and it was uncritically run by the New York Times and the Washington Post, and several major social media companies used that as the reason that they suppressed the story, that Twitter at the time took the New York Post's handle off of Twitter and didn't let them share the story, share news about the story. Facebook didn't allow it to happen. It was heavily suppressed. And I think that the Russian animus, that by extension was the Trump animus, was a big part of that.
I agree with all of what you said. And Tucker Carlson, my point really is just that when Tucker Carlson was covering this laptop story as it broke in October 2020, his position was clearly that the laptop was real, the Russian disinformation story was BS, and that the real story was the suppression of the laptop story. And now I'm just contrasting that with almost 6 years later, when he has Hunter Biden on and just asserts blithely, without ever referencing, as far as I know, Tucker not referencing the reporting that he did with equal certainty back in 2020 that the laptop was, of course, real. He's now, almost 6 years later, saying with equal certainty that obviously the laptop is not real. So that's just a hook that I wanted to give about what I view as the pitfalls of independent media, where, as we've discussed, maybe ad nauseum at this point, the many, many lies and deceptions of Tucker Carlson. And this is just the latest example. It's nothing new. This is par for the course for him. But I wonder if the incentives structure, the way the media landscape is set up now, where this kind of lying and deception is encouraged more in independent media, or maybe in a different way. There's different incentives for deception and lies than there is in the corporate media. And so I want to give a bit of background on how my view of independent media has changed. And we should define what we mean by independent media. We're talking really about political, current events, news in the United States, and maybe a little more broadly the Western world, over the last 10 years or so. And this would be sources of news and commentary that are outside the corporate structure. This would be examples that we're thinking of are people like Tucker Carlson, like Candace Owens, Jimmy Dore, the Young Turks, the Majority Report, Joe Rogan to some extent, Theo Vaughn, people like that, Tim Dillon, people like that. So my perspective has changed because back in 2015-16, when the Trump movement was really getting going, the corporate media was exposed because they were so obviously biased against Trump and suspended any sort of objectivity when it came to Trump. And so the flaws of corporate media were so blatantly exposed. And that's not to say that those flaws hadn't been exposed years earlier with 9/11, and I'm sure you could find stories that are far before my time, but at least for me, and I think a lot of other people, that was like a red pill moment for the media where they showed their true colors during the Trump movement. And then that bled into the Russiagate hoax. And then, in my view, reached a crescendo during COVID, where it was just blatant lies and deception. And again, you can look at past Reality Taboo episodes. We've covered the many, many lies of COVID. Most recently, episode 121, the number that launched 1,000 mandates. We go in depth into that 95% effective figure that was bandied about when the corporate media and the government, the Biden administration, were pushing the COVID clot shot. And we go into detail on how that was just lie after that was just one of many, many lies. So during that time during COVID, when I was trying to figure out what was really going on, I learned quickly that I already knew really that the corporate media couldn't be trusted generally, but it was especially true where I was not going to get legitimate information from the corporate media, so I had to go elsewhere. And there were people like Jimmy Dore who really were not doing anything that you wouldn't expect. Like, they were just doing what you would expect the media to do, to have differing perspectives, to have on dissenters from the mainstream view, people like Dr. Robert Malone or RFK. And maybe they're not right about everything, but they at least have knowledge and a valuable alternative perspective that you just were not getting in corporate media. And so I think independent media served a very valuable role. But I would say over the last couple years, I've noticed that independent media has many issues as well and are subject to negative incentives, maybe in similar way, but also different ways than the corporate media.
Yeah, to be pithy about it, I think what your criticism is that the independent media in the mid-teens and into the early 2020s primarily existed to interrupt the manufacturing of consent, but didn't work to manufacture its own consent. And now increasingly, as it is gaining closer to an equal footing with traditional corporate media, it is doing the same thing that corporate media did. Same in terms of the intent of manufacturing consent. And I think that is, we'll talk about this in detail when we go into Tucker Carlson in further depth, but I think that is very much what he is trying to do, is trying to manufacture a sort of dissident coalition. And so he has a vested interest in making these claims that are somewhat sensational, that do not necessarily mesh with things that he said in the past, but that is par for the course with the corporate media. We are criticizing Tucker Carlson for talking about or asserting that the laptop was real, when in hindsight what he will assert is that the contents on the putative laptop were real, but the laptop wasn't real. But that's in the context of the corporate media giving credulity to the idea that the whole story, the whole Hunter Biden laptop story and everything, all the fallout from it, was originally generated in Russia, which is, from my view, 100 times more significant a whopper than what Tucker Carlson was asserting, assuming that he is lying either in the past or in the present.
I guess, but why does he need to lie like he does so ubiquitously and so, in my view, unnecessarily? Although you seem to think it is necessary in the sense that obviously truth is not his primary concern, despite what he repeatedly says it is, that he repeatedly says as a Christian, truth is the most important thing to him, but he just regularly lies in such blatant, obvious ways. And again, I'm thinking of it's almost comical the way he lies, because he gave an interview where he said, "Is Donald Trump the Antichrist?" And then he was interviewed like less than a week later, the New Yorker, and he claimed just flat out, "I never said that. I never asked whether Donald Trump was the Antichrist." And it's just perplexing to me.
I think it's a little sensationalist to say he lies ubiquitously. That We can look at a transcript to look at what his monologue was from his Wednesday show. If you're going to say that he lies ubiquitously, the definition of that term means that the hour of content that he had there was just full of lies. And I don't think that is the case. And I think you have to be comparative when you're talking about this. I think you give way more credence. You permit the corporate media to lie constantly about massive things, and that doesn't seem to bother you in the same way, to the same extent. And I think one of the problems is the idea that Tucker Carlson is the purveyor of truth is looking at it incorrectly. He's an entertainer with an agenda, and anyone who tries, we've talked about this off air, and probably when we've recorded, we've held up Glenn Greenwald as probably the best example of someone who, to the extent maybe I would say Steve Saylor even more so, but he is even less well-known a name than Glenn Greenwald for exactly this reason, that there is no possible way to get to the position that somebody like Tucker Carlson has by making truth your primary motivator. Someone like Glenn Greenwald, who has the position he does because he was able to be a conduit for one of the biggest stories of the 21st century, and even so, and he's loquacious and hardworking and perspicacious naturally, has high verbal intelligence, he is charismatic, he's funny, he's the entire package, and he has the name recognition, and he was the conduit of the biggest story in the 21st century, and still he can't influence anything. That's the best you can get, and he can't influence any outcomes on anything. He has no constituency, he has no power base that is coming to him to try to network in a way that is going to move how things happen in the real world. And I think squarely that is where Tucker Carlson is now. I've referred to it previously. I'll do so here again. The idea of Tucker Carlson as a sort of dissident godfather, where he is bringing all of these various influencers, people with status, with name recognition, with resources, together, who are not all on the same page necessarily and are at odds in a lot of ways, but he is building a bridge across, or a network with himself in the center, sort of the center node of all of these various, either dissident or in the case of Biden, more bitter and cast out of the managerial state of the globo homo elite structure. He was in good standing and no longer is. And I think maybe the sensationalist claim that Tucker Carlson opened with or teased ahead of the interview with Hunter Biden might have been part of getting the access to Hunter Biden, and understanding that Tucker Carlson wouldn't be in the position he was in if he didn't play fast and loose with the truth is something that doesn't bother me, because I don't take any of the people who are able to ascend to the levels of influence and reach that somebody like Tucker Carlson has. Almost definitionally, these are not going to be people who are primarily, let alone exclusively, motivated and driven by veracity. And if they rhetorically dress what they're doing in truthful, who doesn't? Find me, including the corporate media, any institution, any power structure is always going to dress what it's doing as something that is virtuous, something that is putting truth paramount, putting goodness paramount, whatever the cliche may be. Maybe I'm overly cynical, but I don't expect that from anyone, not from the New York Times, not from Tucker Carlson, not from almost anyone at all that I'm aware of. Because if I am aware of them, unless they're people I've been following for decades, like Steve Saylor, if I am aware of them, then almost definitionally they're not going to fit that criteria. I do wonder what the suspicion you have, Jeff, as to why Tucker Carlson lies as he does, as someone who was raised as a trust funder and could certainly ride off into the sunset comfortably with intergenerational wealth as a trust funder to the 10th generation of his great-great-great-great-great-grandchildren. He could do that instead of doing what he is doing now. And so that's what makes it so interesting, because I think he is trying to build a legitimate political a political power base that is legitimately an alternative to the current globo homo managerial state. I think it still is a pipe dream that has remarkably small chance of succeeding, but I do think that is what he's doing, and he is, to use the reference points that I already talked about, if he has a 1 in 100,000 chance of making it work, well, someone like Glenn Greenwald has a 1 in 100 million chance, and someone like Steve Saylor has a 1 in a bazillion trillion chance. And so that is why I find Tucker Carlson interesting and compelling comparatively.
I find him interesting and compelling as well, perhaps just in a different way. I don't know, and I'm completely speculating. I wonder if he's some sort of government asset or an agent or a Fed of some kind, and I'm not accusing him in any way. I don't have any evidence to support that. It's just his dad did work for Voice of America, which is essentially a CIA cutout, and Tucker is very weird about his dad. Tucker claimed that he didn't know what his dad did for work up until shortly or after, or maybe even after he died a few years ago. So I don't know. And that's part of what's so fascinating about Tucker, because I can't obviously pinpoint what his motivation is for what he's doing, because you're right. Despite the affectation I think he puts forward, he's lived in privilege his entire life. His stepmother was an heir to the Swanson food fortune, and his dad was, as I said, the head of Voice of America.
If the CIA, the American CIA, and its ties to the Mossad, such as they are, if they were permitting Tucker Carlson to say the sort of things he says about Israel as a sort of 4D chess, like triple bank shot way to discredit skepticism among the American public, the Western world, of Zionism and the Israel project in the Middle East, I would find that fascinating, but I am totally incredulous that that is what's going on.
Fair enough. And I would not pretend to know what Tucker's game plan is, what his motivations are. I can only comment on the, just to me, unnecessary, constant lying and deception.
Well, as we have talked about previously, too, that could be compulsory behavior of someone who has an addictive personality, has an addict's personality. And even though addicts are often able to deracinate from their lives the actual physical addiction, a lot of the behaviors surrounding that addiction are things that are ingrained in them, and understandably that they don't view as destructive as the actual thing that they were addicted to, and so they aren't able to exculpate it from their lives as easily.
Yes, and I find that a very compelling argument as well, that a lot of it is maybe a little more prosaic and just a personality defect that or maybe not a defect, I guess, depending on how you look at it, just a pathological or a psychological attribute that he has that possibly explains a lot of his behavior.
Extirpate, not exculpate. My bad. And there is, too, a natural salesmanship style of presentation that lends itself well to being a successful news presenter and pundit. And that salesmanship includes overselling things, which I think Tucker Carlson, again, it could have to do with his addiction, his addictive personality, but I think he takes that to an extreme. But I think it's more a difference in degree rather than something that marks him out as distinct from so many other people in the industry, independent media or corporate media that he's involved in.
So going back to the specific post that Tucker Carlson made in anticipation or promoting the Hunter Biden laptop, where Tucker asserted unequivocally that Hunter Biden's laptop was not real, or it wasn't Hunter Biden's laptop. As many criticisms as I have of the corporate media, I guess Wall Street Journal, that's the main corporate media outlet that I consume by far the most. I do not think they would ever put something like that in their news story. And I think I'm not saying they don't lie and they don't deceive, but I guess maybe it, like Ness was saying, it's just a matter of degree, and they're more skilled. And maybe you could even argue what Tucker does is better, because at least when he lies, you know for sure he's lying. It's obvious he's lying, versus sources like the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, make it much more subtle, and the lies are harder to detect and in some ways more dangerous. But I don't think they would, again, assert something that's so obviously false and that so obviously directly contradicts what they just said a few years ago. I don't think the Wall Street Journal, for instance, would do that.
So you're saying that in 2020, the Wall Street Journal never said that the Hunter Biden laptop didn't exist?
As I recall, the Wall Street Journal was pretty down the middle in how they reported the laptop story. They weren't as maybe slightly sensationalist as New York Post was, with reporting all the salacious details, but they also weren't laundering the intelligence officials denouncing the laptop story as Russian disinformation like New York Times and Washington Post did. So I would say Wall Street Journal probably covered it correctly, but definitely your point is well taken that the corporate media did not, they lied in a similar way as Tucker Carlson did. I guess somewhat ironically is Tucker Carlson in 2026 is actually echoing what the corporate media said about the Hunter Biden laptop story in 2020. So more broadly, I think there are there are overlapping incentives for the corporate media and independent media. The most obvious one is financial incentive. I think that's most clearly shown, at least to me, most clearly shown by Candace Owens, and how much sensationalist, how much attention her coverage of the Charlie Kirk killing has generated. I saw an estimate from Fortune back in December that she generates probably between $2 to $10 million annually, and gets paid speaking fees of $50,000 to $100,000. So there's the obvious just financial incentive that the more sensationalist, over the top, dramatic content you put out, the more money you can bring in. Another thing is that there's less gatekeeping. There's less of a filter between, if Candace Owens has an idea, she just runs the story, versus somebody like the Wall Street Journal. If there's a reporter who wants to report on something, there are layers that it has to go through, and that ideally there's some sort of fact checking, there's some sort of verification and editorial oversight, versus independent media like Tucker. He can just put out a post like that and nobody's really there to stop him.
But of course, conversely, the corporate media has many more important, in my view, more civilizationally destructive people in place to prevent journalists from reporting on the truth. I would rather somebody be able to say whatever it is that they want to say, sensationalize it, and maybe get some truth, than the gatekeeping from the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times that's never going to report anything worthwhile about human biodiversity or the Great Replacement or a lot of the existential questions that Western civilization is facing. Those independent media voices at least can take shots, even though many of them will be off the mark. They can take shots that people working in globo homo inside the managerial state, of which the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, all of corporate media is definitely contained, will never be permitted to say those things. And if they do try to report those things, we learned that for sure in COVID, but there are more 9/11, probably the Ukraine war, all kinds of questions of human biodiversity. There are a lot of journalistic careers that have been destroyed because those institutions of power don't permit the reporting. It's not that they're fact-checking things and then keeping them from being reported on. It is that they are forbidding a lot of things from ever being reported on, no matter how much veracity there is in the facts, if those facts are inconvenient.
And I hope what I'm saying is not coming off as a defense of the corporate media. It's more just reckoning with my own perhaps over-reliance on independent media and not recognizing that a lot of what comes out of outlets, or a lot of what people like Tucker Carlson says, is just blatant falsehood.
But that's what makes it fun. You're an intelligent person. We're intelligent people here. We can judge, we can assess assertions that are made without compelling evidence as probably inaccurate assertions, or contextualize them and understand where they're coming from, and still glean a lot of useful information from people who aren't perfectly aligned with the truth and what they're putting forward. And then there are also, as we've mentioned here, or as I've mentioned anyway, other compelling reasons to follow somebody like Tucker Carlson. I think it is hyperbolic to say that he lies constantly. I think it is probably more accurate to, or at least fairer in my position, from my perspective, to assess it as truth being one of the things that he considers, but is not the predominant or exclusive thing that he is considering. And I think you're going to get that again, to repeat the point made earlier. That is almost definitionally something that you're going to get from a voice that you've heard of, that has the influence and the reach and the popularity that those voices have, because someone who is just dead set at exposing the truth at any cost is never going to get in a position like Tucker Carlson, or have a position at the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or anywhere else. And as for the interview in question here, I did listen to it. My takeaway, having not ever listened to Hunter Biden previously, is that he is not at all a compelling guest, and it was absurdly longer than it should have been. It was stretched over multiple hours. The assessment I have of Hunter Biden is he's probably a 110 IQ guy who doesn't have much of an inner dialogue and doesn't have much perspicacity to offer or much wisdom to give, and he is still selling the access of his name as he did while he was the president's son and the vice president's son previously, and now he is the former president's son. And the only reason still that he is of any interest at all is because of his name and the bitterness that the Bidens probably have at the managerial structure that they were part of and they feel like they were cut out of. And this is, for what it's worth, coming from someone who generally enjoys Tucker Carlson's interviews. I think he is a pretty good interviewer, and I think he brings on dissident guests who are part of that umbrella that he's building, and almost by definition being outside of the corporate structure in a lot of ways, I find them interesting. And so even when someone like myself, who's favorably inclined towards Tucker Carlson and his interviews, has to note this as one of the worst, least compelling ones he's ever done. And I'm not sure exactly what the goal is here, beyond bringing the people such as they are. I don't know how many there are organically who are sympathetic to or fans of Hunter Biden in some way, but had animosity towards Tucker Carlson in the past and no longer will have that same animosity because of this conversation that they had. And so I can slot this into the dissident godfather building his network, building his coalition. Beyond that, I'm at a total loss.
Hunter Biden also recently revealed that his father, Joe Biden's cancer has metastasized and spread. And it's just astonishing to think that Hunter and Jill Biden, Joe's wife, and presume all the aides who were, this was like their last chance, their way to milk Joe Biden's name and cash in. They were all pushing for Joe Biden to run for a second term. And if they had had their way, Joe Biden would be president right now. And so they knew that Joe Biden was demented. He was cancer ridden. They obviously knew he had cancer. They try to pretend like they didn't know. I find that absurd. So I believe that they knew. They obviously knew he was demented, and they almost certainly knew he had cancer, and yet they were still trying to push him to remain president and take the most important job in the world, arguably one of the most cognitively demanding, physically demanding jobs. And it's just crazy to think. The analog or the metaphor, the reference that comes to mind is the Lord of the Rings with Theoden, the king of Rohan, being controlled behind the throne by Grima Wormtongue. And I see Joe Biden as King Theoden and Jill and Hunter as Grima Wormtongue.
But it's not just the Bidens. It was also the corporate media, this same corporate media that we're to some extent giving a pass for. This is years after COVID and years into the Ukraine war and the continuation of lies just as explicit and patently absurd as those made during the Russiagate hysteria, the COVID hysteria. I think it is a continuation, and it is very much a feature rather than a bug of the way that the managerial state operates. And to apologize a little bit for Tucker Carlson at least being directionally still accurate when he asserted back in 2020 that he knew that the laptop was with 100% certainty Hunter Biden's. The backstepping that he's doing now, or the changing of the story now, is effectively that while it wasn't Hunter Biden's laptop, it was information that would have been on Hunter Biden's personal devices, and that the information was all real, but that it wasn't just discovered because Hunter Biden was careless, but it was discovered because someone wanted it to be discovered. So that is the relevance of the assertion he's making now compared to the assertion made in the past, stripped away of whatever lies he is putting forward or whatever concessions he's making to get access or whatever the case might be for why he reported as confidently and now that it wasn't Hunter Biden's laptop. And even leading with that as the story kind of undercuts the direction, because if you just see that in isolation, you might think that the whole thing was false, but that is not at all what Tucker Carlson and Hunter Biden are talking about over the course of a 2.5 hour long interview.
Changing gears a little bit from lies in news media to lies in popular entertainment, we turn to Netflix's show Death by Lightning. Shifting gears a bit from lies in news media to lies in pop culture, I want to discuss an interesting example of propaganda, I think effective propaganda, in pushing at what Ness would describe as global homo values, and in this case diversity and pro-immigration, pro-open borders, the idea that everyone in the world has the right to enter the United States, and as soon they can be from anywhere in the world, and as soon as they step foot on the territory of the United States, they're just as American as anyone else, as a heritage American, somebody who's can trace their family back to the Mayflower. And so the show in question is called Death by Lightning, and it is a dramatization of James Garfield. The premise of the show is kind of a parallel portrait of James Garfield and his murderer, Charles Guiteau. So James Garfield had one of the shortest tenures of any president of the United States. He died on September 19th, 1881, and he would have been sworn in either in January or March of 1881. So he was shot on July 2nd, 1881, and then died on September 19th. And so the actual specific scene I want to explore actually isn't really related to that That's just some context for who James Garfield was. What he's primarily known for is just being president for a few months. But there's a scene in episode 2 of the show. This is in the midst of James Garfield's presidential campaign, and he's running it primarily from his home in Menor, Ohio. And there's this issue of a forged Maury letter, Morey, Maury letter regarding Chinese immigration. And so I'm going to play that scene and then I will comment on it. So before I play the scene, I just want to paint a bit more context. So this is James Garfield coming back to his farmhouse or rural home in Menor, Ohio, in the midst of the campaign. He comes in and one of his allies tells him, look, we got an issue we got to deal with. Something's come up. And James Garfield walks in, and during his campaign, there's people who just show up at his home, and it's kind of like a front porch campaign, and James Garfield comes out and talks to people. And so as he's coming back here, he's trying to figure out what's going on. People are upset, and they're holding up signs, basically anti-Chinese signs, because there's this controversy over this forged letter that purports to show that James Garfield is in support of these Chinese laborers, specifically like in California. And there was very much generally an anti-Chinese worker feeling that the Chinese were undercutting white workers' wages, and that the government needed to do something to stop this importation of cheap Chinese workers.
Congressman, this is the bad news. Let's get you in the house, Pete.
Jim?
They're asserting you wrote a letter to one H. Maury, a Massachusetts unionist.
It says that you endorse the importation of laborers from China, competing for wages with the American workers.
Well, it's nonsense. I've never even met a Maury from Massachusetts. I didn't write it. It's a fraud.
And it is rife with misspellings.
We will issue a denial, a strong condemnation. We will sue this rag, the New York Truth, into extinction.
That's it? You're not even going to consider the toll on the workers?
Young lady, we take this stand in support of American workers.
Not those, the ones out of China. They have just as much a right to be here as anybody else. You and Mom have said so yourselves.
It's just not a stance one can take so freely in this heated a climate.
You can't get elected alderman in America, let alone president, if you take that stand.
But it's wrong. Why aren't you saying anything? He said he'd help people, fight for them. I watched him tell a group of black men he'd just as soon be with them and lose than against them and win. Are these any less human?
Molly.
You doom an entire people just to win.
So at the beginning of that clip I played, it may have been hard to hear what the shouting was of the people out front, but they were saying China out, obviously protesting the Chinese workers, the importation of the Chinese workers, and obviously imploring James Garfield to take a strong stand against them. And there are many lies of both omission and commission. So they just lie about things, but they also leave out things. One of the things they left out is a few months prior to the events portrayed here, when James Garfield was accepting the Republican nomination for president in July 1880, his letter stated, quote, "The recent movement of the Chinese to our Pacific coast partakes but little of the qualities of such an immigration, either in its purposes or its result. It is too much like an importation to be welcomed without restriction, too much like an invasion to be looked upon without solicitude. We cannot consent to allow any form of servile labor to be introduced among us under the guise of immigration." Garfield called Chinese immigration an invasion and an importation of servile labor. So I guess you could square that letter with the scene with James Garfield. And I should have said that the woman calling out James Garfield was his daughter. I guess you could square what she was saying with what James Garfield was saying. The presumption is that quote that I just read was not genuine. James Garfield, he knew better. He was morally superior to what he was saying, but due to the prejudices and the bigotry of the time, he, even a man of high moral quality, and James Garfield is portrayed very positively in this show, even a man like him, in order to obtain power, has to do morally reprehensible things. Or maybe James Garfield really believed what he said. The show doesn't seem to give that possibility a fair shake.
Which is absurd on its face, because of course these same people who were protesting the importation of cheap Chinese labor would have a generation ago been supporting, many of them been supporting the abolition of slavery for the same reasons, that they couldn't compete with the cheaper labor in the southern states. This took place in Ohio, and so there would have been a lot of crossover, and a lot of the same arguments would have been being made with the problem of having cheap labor, effectively indentured menial servitude, instead of the slavery that was in place a generation ago. And many of those workers who were opposed to the importation of cheap Chinese workers would have also been opposed to the continuation and expansion of slavery for virtually the same economic reasons.
So when I first watched this scene, I just knew intuitively it was BS. I didn't know, I'm not super familiar with this particular era of American history. I've read a little bit about the Gilded Age, but I knew enough to know that this just, it did not pass the smell test. And so then I did some research, and there's so many problems with that scene. The girl in question, Molly Garfield, who calls out her father, James Garfield, she wasn't even consistently present at the Menor home in Ohio during the campaign. And according to the National Park Service, she stayed weekdays with the Mason family over in Cleveland, and she only returned to Menor on weekends. She was present on Election Day, which is November 2nd, 1880, but the weekly campaign activities, it's almost certain that she would not have been present when the news of this Maury letter broke. And then just the idea, the anachronistic idea that a white girl from rural Ohio in 1880 would call out her father like this and talk about the moral imperative of supporting Chinese immigration. It's just absurd. America was obviously a white nationalist country at the time, and the idea that a 13-year-old would have spouted 2025 progressive views on immigration, multiculturalism, is just absurd. And it's just an obvious over-the-top example of presentism, which is the idea of projecting contemporary values onto historical figures to make those values seem timeless and obvious rather than contingent and contested. And I think that's the crux of it. It what makes it so effective and pernicious is that if you're somebody who doesn't know a lot about American history and is kind of just a normie person watching a Netflix show, you're not necessarily, this is not gonna strike, it's subtle enough where it's not going to be obvious, and that's what makes it so effective as propaganda. So Chinese workers started arriving in California beginning with the gold rush in 1849 and then accelerating with railroad construction in the 1860s. And then by 1880, Chinese migrants constituted about 12% of male working age population in Western states and 25%, a quarter of California's workforce. And the Central Pacific Railroad paid Chinese workers about $27 to $30 per month versus $35 per month to white workers. And so by 1880, where the year that the show primarily takes place during the presidential campaign in which James Garfield ultimately won, both the Democratic and Republican Party platforms endorsed Chinese restriction. So the issue wasn't whether to restrict immigration, but only over how and how much restriction. And so that context makes it clear why this forged Maury letter H.L. Morey was apparently not even a real person, but it nearly cost Garfield the election, and it was damaging precisely because it made Garfield appear to support unlimited corporate importation of cheap labor. And the forged letter claimed Garfield believed, quote, individuals and companies have the right to buy labor where they can get it cheapest, and opposed abrogating the treaty with China, quote, until our great manufacturing and corporate interests are conserved in the matter of labor. And so the dissemination of this letter supposedly sparked the Denver anti-Chinese riot on October 31st, 1880. And then Garfield ultimately ended up just barely, narrowly losing California. And it's likely that this letter cost him California and ultimately almost cost him the presidential election because he won the popular vote by less than 0.1%. An interesting coda to this whole story and to the show, in the final episode when Garfield ultimately dies from his assassination wound, his vice president, Chester Arthur, is portrayed as nobly carrying on Garfield's legacy. But in fact, in reality, on May 6th, 1882, which was about less than 8 months after Garfield's death, President Chester Arthur signed the Chinese Exclusion Act into law. This act passed with bipartisan support, passed the House 201 to 37. It banned Chinese laborers for 10 years, denied citizenship to Chinese residents, and required Chinese travelers to carry certificates or face deportation. It was the first U.S. law to exclude an entire ethnic group and would not be repealed until 1943. And the point is, in reality, this was not a betrayal of Garfield's vision. It was the fulfillment. But of course, you wouldn't know any of that by watching this Netflix show. And so I think the cumulative impact of propaganda like this, when this type of messaging appears ubiquitously across television, streaming platforms, YouTube, educational content, I think it can help shape public framing, and it can convince viewers that Americans have always known that restricting immigration is morally wrong, and that anyone in history who supported demographic change controls was simply bigoted and benighted, and they were not responding to any sort of genuine economic and social pressures.
The purpose, of course, is not historical accuracy, nothing close to it. The purpose is to manufacture cultural consent. It might seem like the support for the importation of unfettered importation of Chinese workers in the late 19th century was a Koch brothers proposal, and that would be essentially correct. But today, the moral status boost people get from taking the same position that was made to be morally evident in the clip that Jeff played from this show is something that permits people to watch this not for the historical value, but for the entertainment value of it, and then also feel like they are on the right side of history, that they're making tough decisions today to support the same things that all of the power structures want them to support. And that because they watch this historical drama or whatever the show bills itself as, that they also are getting knowledge about history. And so they are learning about history and making difficult moral decisions. And so in so many ways are better people for having seen this, having experienced this show, when in reality, they know even less about American history than people who never would have seen the show at all. And so that sounds like this show is succeeding doing exactly what it is intended to do, exactly what Globo Homo, what the managerial state wants it to do. And since we are speaking of fiction, let me spring a question you're unprepared for on you about how you would identify in a fictional setting. You are playing a role-playing game, and you can choose to either be a white woman, a black man, or a homosexual white man. Who are you most likely to choose?
I'd pick a white woman.
interesting and probably more consistent. I had this thought earlier in the week, and though I am someone who self-styles himself as a race realist who understands a working definition of race as a very large extended family with some level of interbreeding taking place, even so, I instinctively identify more with the black man than the homosexual white man or the white woman. And so the point of the little thought experiment, such that it is, or such that there is a point at all, is to try to get at what part of identity do you put the most emphasis on. And I would have thought blindly going into it before entertaining this thought experiment for whatever reason that I did, that I would have put race first, but I think actually I would put my sex first, and then my sexual orientation, and then my race third of those three things. And this is just a thought that occurred to me and something I was surprised at my answer on, but that I couldn't deny that it was my answer, and so I will just leave it there as is. Jeff giving an answer different than my own might indicate that I'm more out of step than I had imagined to be the case, but I think there is probably some insight that it provides into the widespread gender bending that Generation Alpha and the Zoomers have partaken in, according to surveys on the subject, with something like 25% of those under the age of 18 now identifying as something other than heterosexual. And I had imagined, thinking through this, that if sex, in my view, is more core to my identity even than race, and yet 1 in 4 of the upcoming generation is fine shuffling around their self-perceived sex, well, the same parameters would be in place for them to do the same with racial identification or sexual orientation. I guess this is a kind of a rambling way of saying that this is indicative of how little importance is placed on living in accordance to one's own actual identity and the corresponding importance of being able to customize and create an identity out of a whole bunch of other potential identities. And that will be a ham-fisted segue into another brief item I want to cover here to show that this is not a phenomenon that is coming totally out of the blue. I think there is a history of this removal of the importance of natural identity in place of the ability to, like Mr. Potato Head, take pieces of one's identity off and put other pieces of identity on. And I think that has been prevalent in the culture at a growing rate for over a century. And what I'm going to use as evidence here is a series of given first names in America that within the last century, sometime within the last century, some of them just a few years ago, some of them several decades ago, but all of the names we're going to go through here, all of them were predominantly, if not exclusively, male names within the last century. This is by no means an exhaustive list. It is an illustrative list based on a handful of names that are the most well-known and that emphasize the point most trenchantly, but again, there are many other names that fit this same pattern, and as we've mentioned previously, the pattern is always, without exception, male names becoming female names over time. So here they are, a list of names that within the last century were predominantly or exclusively male names that are, as you'll hear as we go through this list, now almost exclusively female names. Addison, Allison, Ashley, Brooke, Cassidy, Charleston, Dana, Darcy, Emerson, Emery, Finley, as in Fit Finley, the wrestler, Hadley, Harley, as in Harley Davidson, Harper, Hillary Clinton, yes, that used to be within the last century a predominantly male name, Jody, Kelly, Kelsey, Kendall, Kennedy, Kim, Lauren, Leslie, Lindsay, Madison. That is, I believe, the fourth or fifth name ending with SON, because these given names were historically names given to the sons of the first part of the given name, as in Addison was Addis's son, Allison was Al's son, etc. Madison, again, Meredith, Michelle, Monroe, Morgan, Peyton, as in Peyton Manning, the after Tom Brady, probably the best known NFL quarterback of the last 20 years, Reese, Riley, Robin, as in Robin and Batman, Skylar, Stacy, Sydney, as in Sydney Carton from Tale of Two Cities, Taylor, and Whitney, as in Whitney Eli. Of course, the more well-known name today is Whitney Houston. I haven't done my due diligence to see if anything like this trend existed centuries in the past. My instinct is very much that it was not the case. If we go back a few centuries into English history, which I am familiar with, back in the time of Shakespeare, 14th, 15th, even before that 12th, 13th century, the given names of the population at any point in time, names like John and William, just those two names alone constituted more than half of the male population, and similar things with first names like Abigail for women. And so there was virtually, from my understanding, although again I haven't done the due diligence to see if this is true, I will. My understanding is that in the past, those given names were not unisex. They were very much sex specific and had always been sex specific until the end of the 19th century, and definitely coming on strong in the 20th century, which is a trend that has only accelerated since then. And so the neo-reactionary in me is maybe trying to create a continual progression from the excesses of the Enlightenment that show up in naming conventions 100 years ago to the gender bender insanity that I think, are only taking a brief reprieve from. I do not think that this is a fever that is broken and is going away forever. But whatever you assess the merit of that read of the situation as being, if you want to protect a son of yours or a future son of yours from falling fate to his name becoming a feminized name over the course of his lifetime, the best thing you can do is to ground his name historically as possible. Biblical names are the surest bet. So far as I can tell, there's not a single instance of a male name in the Bible ever becoming a female name over time. To strain a segue even harder, if the Enlightenment could be said to have killed God, well, the death of God is contributing, it could be argued, to the death of humanity. Looking at the General Social Survey, I looked at theistic orientation, that is belief in God, and for factors that I think from a modern cultural perspective, measure an orientation towards life and the perpetuation of it, or the opposite. The first is quite simple. That is fertility, total fertility rate for people. And I use the same parameters that I did last week from 2012 to the present to get a snapshot of modern American life. Admittedly, it's a little bit arbitrary, but the start of the second Obama administration very much feels like the contemporary world that we still inhabit today. And so this data is all from 2012 to the present. By theistic orientation, these are adults. Total fertility for people who self-describe as atheist is 1.17 children. Those who self-describe as agnostic at 1.12. Those I characterize as uncertain believers as at 1.47, and those who are firm believers, those who say that they definitively know that God exists, at 2.09. And so what we see is only those who are firm theists are even at replacement level, and even in their case, just barely so. Moving on to abortion, to the question of should a woman be able to have an abortion for any reason? So this is the most permissive understanding of abortion. It's not for the health of the mother or for rape or any of the other conditions that are often used in support of more permissive attitudes toward abortion. This is simply the woman is pregnant, doesn't want to be pregnant anymore, doesn't matter when it is, doesn't matter if it's a day before the birth, doesn't matter if the family, if the husband disagrees, if the woman wants the abortion, she should be able to have it at any time. Those who are atheist, 86% support the right of a woman to have an abortion at any time. Among those who are agnostic, 80%. Those who are uncertain believers, 64%, and those who are firm believers, 29%. On the question of capital punishment, that is, in the case of someone being convicted of murdering someone else, the percentages by theistic orientation who think that capital punishment should be carried out by the state. Among atheists, it's 48%. Among agnostics, 58%. Among uncertain believers, 67%. And among firm believers, 70%. And so the differences there are less distinct than on the actual procreative output and on the question of abortion. And parenthetically, to the objection that support for capital punishment is not supportive of life, but is actually the opposite. In the case of homicide, it is driven by a desire to protect life. That is why it is scripturally commanded in Genesis that those who commit homicide have to be put to death. That is why it can certainly, and was through virtually all of Christian history until the last 100 years, it was taken for granted that loving all of human creation meant distributing justice to those deserving of justice. And in delivering that justice, including up to and including capital punishment, that was not at odds with the idea of loving those who are condemned to death for what they have done, but instead giving them their just deserts was actually the best thing for them and the best thing to help morally reconcile them with their creator in the afterlife. And so this is the image of the thieves being crucified alongside Christ and the one saying that he deserves to die and Jesus blessing him for that, not stopping him from dying, which in the Christian framework Jesus would have been able to do, but instead of doing that, he blessed the man for understanding that he needed to die. And that is how the Christian church viewed capital punishment for centuries, for millennia, for all of recorded history up until, again, the last few decades or centuries when it has been seen as something that is more controversial from a Christian perspective. But historically, it has been something very much in line with a Christian perspective to support capital punishment. And support for capital punishment has broadly been a position that has been supported in the Western world until recently. And finally, I looked at the question of suicide. That is, should someone be able to commit suicide or have assisted suicide? Should physicians be able to aid someone in committing suicide if that person is simply tired of living? That is, like the abortion question, the most permissive idea of suicide. It's not for a chronic disease. It's not for even poverty or old age. It's just the person decides that they don't want to live anymore. Should they be able to go ahead and end their lives? Those who are atheists, 49% support that. Among agnostics, it's 44%. Among uncertain believers, 28%. And among firm believers, just 14%. And so maybe it is that the more pro-life positions are the hidebound, retrograde positions, and the more libertine, permissive positions are the more enlightened ones. Or maybe there is something dark about the Enlightenment that is going to end up being the extinction of the human species. Because in our Enlightenment, we killed God, and then killing God killed us. And if that wasn't blackpilling enough, I will close off with another black pill to wash the other black pills down. Jeff alluded at the beginning of the recording to how the corporate media had reached a sort of crescendo of dishonesty and fabrication in the COVID response and the COVIDian nightmare that lasted from roughly 2020 to 2022, with the insinuation being that collectively the populations of the world have learned a thing or two from that debacle, those series of debacles, and so in the future something like that wouldn't be able to happen again. I am unsurprisingly more cynical, and I'll bring some survey data to buttress that cynicism. From the Economist YouGov this week, a question was asked, quote, "If there is a pandemic, would you support or oppose a policy that made it mandatory to wear masks in public places?" Unquote. Among the general population, 62% support to just 28% in opposition. Among Harris voters, 91% support to 5% oppose. Among Trump voters, it's 31% in support to 59% in opposition. So among Trump supporters, among MAGA, there is a majority who would instinctively oppose that public mandate for masks to be worn, but the overwhelming majority of Democrats and also the overwhelming majority of moderates and independents, if we look at political moderates, 67% would support it to just 21% opposing. So by a more than 3-to-1 margin, moderates would support this, which is why in the general population, it's over 3-to-1 in support. If we move from political orientation to generational cohort, though, that's where things really get depressing from my perspective. Among Zoomers, those under the age of 30, 80% support the public mandating of masks compared to just 8% in opposition. So it's 10-to-1 among the youngest section of the population. Among millennials, it's 56% in support compared to 29% in opposition. Among Xers, 53% support, 38% opposition, and among boomers, 65% support to 30% opposition. So Zoomers, it's 10-to-1 in support of masks. And among boomers, the ones who would presumably benefit the most from everyone having to wear masks, it's just 2-to-1 support. And so just as was the case in Oceania with kids turning in their parents eagerly to the party, so when COVID 2.0 comes out, it is going to be the children who are going to be running to the authorities to rat out their parents for not wearing a mask and not social distancing, not getting the jab, and not following all of the other commands from on high. That'll do it for us this week. Thanks for listening. We'll talk to you next time.